We're on DAF Tes Zayin Amud Aleph, the third line in the Gemara, Amar Rava. So we have a lot of Agadata to cover up the story from the beginning, from the middle to the end of the Megillah now. Amar Rava, Lo Mipnei She'ohavin es Mordechai Ela Mipnei Shesonin es Haman. We're actually on the beginning of the line, Lo Naasa Imo Davar. That if you remember the story was that Achashverosh can't sleep. They read for him the annals of the history of what's happened, the chronicles of the last several months. They tell, or the years, and they tell him that there was this fellow Mordechai that saved his life by revealing to him an assassination plot against his life. And Achashverosh asks the readers who are reading him this chronicle, they said, what happened to him? And they said, Lo nasa imo davar, nothing. He was never rewarded for his valor. And so the Gemara wants to point out is that it's not that all of a sudden you have courtiers in the court of the king who are in favor of the Jews. It's not that anti-Semitism had been eliminated in some pockets of Persia. Just to the contrary, but rather what? Lo mipnei she'ovin es Mordechai el mipnei shesonim es Haman. But they hated Haman. They couldn't stand Haman. So it's not like there was any love for the Jews that was taking place when these readers told him that Mordechai had not been rewarded. Okay, the story continues, and all of a sudden the king hears that someone is in the courtyard. He says to them, "Who's in the courtyard?" And they tell him that here's Haman coming, and the pasuk says that Haman was coming. Lislos Mordechai al ha'etz asher hechin lo, to tell the king that he wanted to hang Mordechai on the tree that he had already planned to be his gallows. So the words hechin lo, that he prepared for him. So Tana lo hechin. The Bryce explains that the word for him is referring to himself. That really, ultimately, Haman had prepared the gallows for himself, not for Mordechai. When Achashverosh asks Haman, "What should we do to the person whom the king wishes to honor?" So Haman, thinking that it's a reference to himself, talks about taking a horse, the king's horse, and clothing the honored man in the king's clothing and riding him around town and saying, "So shall be done to the person whom the king wishes to honor." So Achashverosh says, "I love the idea." He says, "Va'asechein leMordechai." So do that to Mordechai. So Amar lei. So now Haman is sheepish. And he says, Mano Mordechai, which Mordechai are you referring to? Amar lei ha-Yehudi. I'm referring to Mordechai the Jew. Amar lei tuva Mordechai ika b'Yehudai. There are plenty of guys named Mordechai among the Jews. So Amar lei ha-Yoshev b'Shar HaMelech. And therefore the pasuk specifies it's the Mordechai that you and I both know is sitting in the gates of the king. So Amar lei, so Haman says back, Hahu sagi lei b'chad diskorta inami b'chad nahara. So Haman says, what do you need to give him all of that public honor? That Mordechai would be happy if you give him the tax of one of your towns or the tax of one of your rivers. Just give him control and make him a wealthy man. That's all he wants. So Amar lei, hanami havlei. So Achashverosh says, good idea. Give that to him also. In other words, take him around town and give him all that wealth. Al tapel davar mikol asher dibarta. That's why the pasuk says, "Do not leave off anything that you have mentioned," implying that there was more that Haman had recommended that does not appear in the pasuk, as the Gemara had just told us. The pasuk then says, "Vayikach Haman es halavush ve'es hasus," that Haman takes all of the clothing and the horse that he has suggested. Azal ashkechei diyasvi rabbanan kamei umachbi lehu hilchas kamitza l'rabbanan. And he goes to find Mordechai. Where does he find him? He finds him. He's sitting with the sages, showing them the laws of Kemitza, the laws of taking a fistful of flour for a flour offering. Rashi explains to us that today was the 16th of Nisan. It was the first day of Chol HaMoed Pesach, and it was the day of the offering of the Korban HaOmer. So therefore, Mordechai was merely teaching in Yana Dioma, something that was topical for that day, even though there was no temple, but they wanted to study the laws of how to bring the Korban HaOmer. So he was showing them how to do Kemitza. Kevin dechazye Mordechai da'apik lekable v'susei mechad biyodei mirsas. Mordechai sees Haman approaching. He sees him leading a horse along, and he gets very scared. He thinks that something terrible is about to happen. So Amar Lahu Rabbanan Hay Rishia Lamiktal Nafshe Kaasi Zilu Mikamei Dilo Sechvu Begachalta. So he says, turns to the other sages, he says, you guys better back off. This man is coming to kill me. You better scatter because I don't want you to be burned by my coals. In other words, he's going to be coming after me. I don't want you to be part of the collateral damage. So at that moment, Mordechai arises and he begins to daven the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, because he wants to daven to Hashem for salvation. So here you have all of the sages that have been listening to Shir. They're backed over to one side. You've got Mordechai davening his Shemona Esrei, and you've got Haman waiting patiently, holding a horse, waiting for Mordechai to finish his Shemona Esrei. So Amar Lahu b'mayaski. So I guess while he's waiting, he turns to the sages and he says, what are you guys studying? What were you doing when I came here? So Amrulei bisman shebeis hamikdash kayim man deminadev mincha maisi molei kumtse desulta umiskaperlei. So they explained to him, well, when the temple was standing, if a person wanted to bring a flour offering, all he would have to do is take a fistful of flour, and he could atone his sins thereby. So Amar Lahu, Asa Male Kumtsa Kimcha Didchu B'dachi Asara Alfi Kikori Kasbadidi. So Haman marveled to himself. He says, how could it be that your fistful of flour that you've been studying has been able to trump the 10,000 talents of silver that I have offered to Achashverosh in order to wipe you out? Apparently that money that I've offered has been overridden by your fistful of flour. So Tosfos points out that if you take the amount of 10,000 talents of silver and you divide it up among 600,000 Jews, you get a machatzis shekel, you get a half a shekel for each Jew. So there was something here that Haman was trying to overpower, but no, it's not going to work. So Amar Lei Rasha, Eved Shekana Nechasim, Eved Labi Nechasim Lemi. At this point, I guess Mordechai is finished with his Shemona Esrei, so he turns to Haman and he says to him, you wicked one, if a servant acquires property, who does the servant belong to and who does the property belong to? So all of that money that you gave to Achashverosh wasn't your money to give in the first place because you're my servant. Now what he meant by that is that the Gemara elsewhere tells us, Chazal, there's a medrash that tells us that earlier in life, years before, Haman had been Mordechai's servant. And through a series of events that we don't know exactly what happened, Haman was able to break free and was able to rise to power and become one of the ministers of Achashverosh's court. Amar le kum levosh hanimani urechov haisusya deboy lach malka. So Haman basically turns to Mordechai and he says, arise, Mordechai, put on this clothing and ride this horse because this is what the king has requested. Amar le lo yachilna adai lana lebeibani ve'eshkol amazya delav orach aralish damushe b'mani demalka hachi. So Mordechai says, I'm sorry, I can't. I've been fasting. I've been wearing sackcloth. I haven't bathed because I'm in a state of mourning for the edict. So I can't wear the king's clothes in this unshaven, unkempt state. I can't ride the king's horse this way. I need to go to the bathhouse and take a bath. I need to get a haircut. So I can't do that. So Shadra Esther v'asartinu l'kulu b'nei bani l'kuli umnei. Esther, hearing that Mordechai needed to take a bath and to get a haircut, she immediately ordered to seal all of the bathhouses and close up all the barbershops. Now, what was her plan? Her plan was to humiliate Haman even further and force him to have to take care of Mordechai's bath and haircut personally. So ayale ihu lebei bani va'aschei va'azl va'aisi zuzu mi beise v'kashakal bei ma'azyeh. So that's exactly what happened, is that Haman was forced to give him a bath and to cut his hair personally by getting a pair of scissors from his own house. Bahadi de kashakale ingid ve'isnach. As he was cutting Mordechai's hair, he groaned and he sighed. So Amar le amai kol misnachas. So Mordechai says to him, why are you sighing? So Amar le gavr dahavachashiv le lamalka mikulu rav revanohe hashta li shavyuha balane v'safar. He says, woe is me. I used to be one of the highest ministers of the king, and now I've been reduced to being a bath attendant and a barber. So Amarle, Russia, V'lav Safar Shel Kfar Kartzam Hayisa. So he says to him, you wicked one, don't think you can forget your past. I remember when you were a barber of the village of Kartzam, the barber of Seville, the barber, you were just a lowly barber. Don't think that you can escape your past. You've just resorted back to what you really are. So Tana Haman Safar Shel Kfar Kartzam Hayesum Shnayim Shana, and the Brisa tells us that he was a barber in this village of Kartzam for 22 years. Basar de Shaklinu Lamazye Lavshinu Lamane, and so after Haman gets his Mordechai gets his haircut, Haman clothes him in the special clothing of the king. Amr Le Sakur Achav. So Haman says to Mordechai, okay, get up on the horse. So Amar Le Lo Yachilon de Kechisha Chiloi Mimei Ta'anesa. Mordechai says, I'm sorry, I can't. This is my third day of fasting. Remember, Mordechai began his fast on the 14th of Nisan. Today's the 16th of Nisan, third day of fasting. I'm too weak to climb up on the horse by myself. So Gachin Visalik. So Haman had no choice. He had to bend over to act as a footstool for his back was now the footstool for Mordechai's foot. Kisolak BAYT Bey. And as Mordechai was getting up on Haman's back, Mordechai kicks him. So Amar Le Lo Ksiv Lechu B'nafol Oyevecha Al Tismach. So Haman says to him, you Jews, I thought you're compassionate to your enemy. Doesn't it say that when your enemy falls, do not rejoice? And here you are, you're kicking me when I'm down. So Amar Le Hani Mili Bi Yisrael. He says that's only true about a Jewish enemy. But with people who have tried to annihilate us, to destroy us, the pasuk in Tehillim says, you shall trample on his high places, referring to your back. So therefore, I'm justified in giving you a good kick on my way up to the horse. So we continue along in the story. I wish we had more time to analyze all of these different little zingers, but we'll have to...
You had strength to kick him.
Yeah, it's interesting. He didn't have strength to climb up to the horse, but he had strength to kick him. Right. He was saving his strength. So here we have the story that here we have Haman leading Mordechai on the horse throughout the city of Shushan, and he's forced to call out, so shall be done to the man whom the king wishes to honor. So ki havenakid va'azul b'shvila devei Haman chazise barate de kaima igra. So his daughter sees him because one of the streets that he takes Mordechai through is his own street where he lives. His daughter's on the rooftop. She sees this spectacle. Savra hay derachiv avua v'hay damaski kamei Mordechai, and she mistakenly thinks that the man who's on the horse with all of the glory and pomp, that's her father. And the guy who's schlepping the horse along, that must be Mordechai. So Shakla atzitza de beisakise v'shadisi aresha de avua. She takes the chamber pot, which is where the old-fashioned toilet, and spills it out over the man who's leading the horse, thinking that it's Mordechai. It lands on her father's head, as you know. So daliene v'chazis de avuahu nafla me'igra la'ara v'mesa. She lifts up her eyes, in other words, she focuses more carefully and realizes that she's just poured excrement on her father's head and is so distraught that she throws herself off the roof and dies. And that's now how we can have an interpretation of the psukim, that after this whole story finishes, Mordechai goes back home to the gate of the king. Not home, he goes back to where he was, to his sackcloth at the gate of the king. And Amar Rav Sheisha Sheshav L'Sako L'Tanei, so he went back to his sackcloth and his fasting. V'Haman nidchaf el beiso avel v'chafui rosh. And Haman, the pasuk says, returns back or is pushed back to his home as a mourner and as someone whose head is covered. So Avel albito b'chafoi rosh al she'ira lo, that he's a mourner because his daughter has just perished, and he's has his head covered because he's got dung all over his head. Vayisaper Haman lezeresh ishto l'chalo havav. So he gets home and he tells Zeresh, his wife, and all of his friends all that has befallen him. The next part of the pasuk says, "Vayomeru lo chachama v'zeresh." So then his wise men said to him, plus his wife Zeresh. So the Gemara says there seems to be a discrepancy between the first part and the second part of the pasuk. Kari luhu ohava v'kari lu chachama. First, the pasuk calls these people in his house his friends, and then it ends up calling them his wise men. So how do you reconcile that? So Omer Rabbi Yechanan kol ha'omer davar b'chachma afilu b'umo sa'olam nikra chacham. The answer is that any time a person says a word of wisdom, even if he's not from the Jewish people, but if he says words of wisdom, even though he's just a regular guy, you should call him a wise man. So these were really just Haman's friends. He had drinks with them, whatever. But the point is, once they said words of wisdom, the pasuk attributes to them as being wise men. What were the words of wisdom that they said? They said, "Im mizera haYehudim Mordechai." They said to him, if Mordechai is from the seed of the Yehudim, of the Jews, then you're not going to be able to defeat him. So Amru lei imishar shvatim kasi yachal lei v'imeshevet Yehuda Binyamin v'Ephraim u'Menashe leyachal lei. The deeper meaning of what they said to him was as follows: if Mordechai comes from any of the other tribes, you may be able to defeat him. But if he comes from one of these four, from Yehuda, Ephraim, Menashe, or Binyamin, you won't be able to defeat him. Yehuda dichsiv yadcha ba'erev oivecha, because by Yehuda it says that when Yaakov blessed Yehuda, he told him, your hand will be at the throat of your enemy. And Enoch, and when it comes to Ephraim, Binyamin, and Menashe, it says, Lifnei Ephraim, Binyamin, and Menashe, Orags es gevurasecha, that, O God, you shall arouse your might in front of Ephraim, Binyamin, and Menashe. And as we know, that Mordechai was descended from both Yehuda and from Binyamin. So therefore we know that he had this special power. So kinafol tipol lefanav, and they further told Haman that you shall surely fall before him. Now this double language of falling is what is curious to the Gemara. Darash Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai shtei nefilos halolu lama. Why is the double language of falling? So Amrulo umazu meshula la'afer, because they were telling him that the Jews are a double-edged sword, that they are compared both to earth umeshula lekochavim, and they're compared to stars. Kishahin yordim ad afer, when they are low, they go to the lowest of the low. They go down all the way down to the dirt. Uchishain olin ad lekochavim, and when they go up, they go all the way up to the stars. In other words, you might have thought that the Jewish people are at their low point, but in reality they are at their apex, going up to the stars. And therefore, not only will you fall, you will surely fall. You're going to have a real a failure, because the Jews are now at their point of great ascendancy. And at that very moment, after they told him that, the officers of the king arrived, Vayavhilu, and they hurriedly rushed Haman to Esther's banquet. This teaches us that they brought him with great hurriedness, and as Rashi says, he still hadn't cleaned himself up from the chamber pot that had been poured onto his head. So here he is, this smelly, disheveled guy, Haman, is now being brought to the party of the queen. And now the Gemara runs through the story, does fast forward, and we're up to the part where Esther has this big revelation to Achashverosh, and she tells him that there's someone who's trying to destroy me and my people. I have been sold up the river with my people. They want to destroy us. And she says that she says that the oppressor does not really care about the damage to the king. And what she was telling him is that this oppressor Haman really doesn't care about any injury that befalls you through his terrible plot. So ikni ba bevashli v'katla. Because after all, look what he's done so far. He caused a jealousy over Vashti, and that caused her to be killed. And now he's jealous of me, and he wants me to be killed as well. So then the pasuk says, "Vayomer Melech Achashverosh, Vayomer LaEsther Hamalka." So the king Achashverosh speaks, and he speaks to Queen Esther. Why does it have to say speaking twice? So Vayomer Lamali, Amar Rabbi Avo, Batchil al Yedei Turgaman Kaven de Amar Le, Ana Bas Melachim de Beisholka Asina, Miyad Vayomer La Esther Hamalka. Because originally, before Esther revealed her true identity, Achashverosh would not speak to her directly. She was a commoner after all, and it was beneath his dignity and the station of the king to speak directly to someone who was not of royal stock. So even though it was his wife and she was the queen, he never spoke to her. He spoke to her through an intermediary. But then she says, my name is Esther. I am descended from King Saul, the king of Israel. He says, oh, now I can speak to you directly. And that's why it says Vayomer twice. The first time he spoke to her was through an intermediary. And now that he's speaking to her now directly. Vatomer Esther ish sar ve'oyev Haman hara hazeh. So Esther says, this oppressor and enemy, this wicked Haman, Amar Rabbi Lazar Melamed Shahisa Mechave Klape Achashverosh Uba Malach Besarta Yoda Klape Haman. Now, it's a little bit strange, the language. It says, this oppressor and enemy, and then she says, this wicked Haman. So it seems like she's sort of shifting in the middle, because she could have identified Haman right away. So this leads the Gemara to say that she was really referring to another oppressor of the Jews, Achashverosh himself, because after all, when you think about it, her life was made wretched and miserable through Achashverosh. This man forcibly takes her from her home, is raping her constantly, and therefore she really was trying to point the finger at Achashverosh first and saying, this terrible oppressor. And then an angel comes and pushes her arm to point to Haman instead and says, Haman hara hazeh. Okay, so the king now is told that Haman is trying to kill Esther and her people. The Hamelech kam b'chamaso, and the king arises in his anger. And what does he do? What's the first thing that he does? He tries to cool off by going out into the garden, if you remember the story. So then it says, V'hamelech shav miginas habisan. And then he returns, and it calls him the Melech the second time. So the Gemara's question is, why do you have to say the word Hamelech twice? So Makeshiva Lakima, Makima Bechema, Avshiva Bechema. The answer is to tell you that he did not cool off by going out into the garden. If anything, his anger was even more flared after going out into the garden, because something happened in the garden that kept his anger strong. What was going on? The Azul va'ashkach l'malache hashares, the itmulei kegavre, the akri li'iloni debustani. What happened was he goes out into the garden, and he sees a bunch of guys out in his garden. They were really, says the Gemara, they were angels disguised as men, who were pulling out the trees in his expensive trees in his garden. Va'amr lahu mai uvdaichu. And he said to them, what are you guys doing? So Amrulay defaktinan Haman. Yeah, Haman told us, he put in a work order to tell us to uproot these trees. So Asalabay say Haman nofel alamita. And then he comes back, Achashverosh comes back into the house, just as angry, and he sees Haman, the pasuk says, is falling on Esther. Now, the question that the Gemara has is, why does it say falling in the infinitive or present tense? It should have said, Nafal mi borle. Haman fell on Esther. Amar Rabbi Lazar melamed sheba malach v'hipilo aleha. This teaches me that Haman fell because an angel pushed him onto Esther. He tried to get up, and the angel pushed him back down. Kept trying to get up, the angel pushes him back down. So that's why it's in the infinitive, because it was happening repetitively. And therefore the king sees this, and Omar, Vaimi Besa, Vaimi Bra. And he says, I have no peace from this Haman, either outside in my garden or inside in my house. He's trying to completely uproot everything that I've been working so hard for. So therefore, Vayomer Hamelech Hagam Lichbosh es Hamalka imi baboyes. And that's why he says, Hagam, are you also trying to conquer my queen in my own house? Because I just came back from the garden, you're trying to uproot my trees, and now you're also trying to conquer my queen. Vayomer Charvona, the Gomer. So now, Charvona pipes up. Who is this guy Charvona all of a sudden shows up in the middle of nowhere? So Charvona is one of the advisors of the king, and we say in the song that we sing, Vigam, Vigam, Charvona. Charvona should be remembered for the good, right? So the Gemara wants to point out to us that Charvona was not this great tzaddik of a guy, because Amar Rabbi Lazar av Charvona Rasha ba'osa eitzah. He's the one who came up with the idea that you should use the gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordechai and use it on Haman himself. But you have to know that Charvona was no friend of the Jews. He was an ally of Haman originally. But Kevin Shirashal Niskaima Atsaso Miyad Borach. But he became a turncoat. Once he saw that Haman was on the losing side, he ran to the other side. Right? That's what evil cowards do. They always try to find favor with the side that's winning. So Vahinu Dichsiv Vayashlech Allah Velo Yachmol Miyado barach yivrach. It's the pasuk in Eov that when God sends His wrath upon a person without mercy, all of a sudden all of his friends run away from him. The next part of the pasuk says that after Haman is hanged, b'chamas hamelech shachacha, that the anger of the king was abated. Now, this language of shachacha has an extra letter chaf. So the Gemara's question is, this is a double language of abatement. Shtei shechichos halolu lama. Why two terms of abatement? Echa shel malchos shel olam vecha shel achashverosh, is to tell us that there were two kings whose anger was abated. One was God's anger, was abated against the Jews, because after the Jews did tshuva, through this whole process, Hashem's anger against them was abated, and Achashverosh's anger was abated as well. V'amri la echa shel Esther vecha shel Vashti. Others learn that the two angers being abated are the two angers of Achashverosh. One was his anger or his upset over Vashti's death, and the other one was the upset over Esther's almost death. Now the Gemara goes into an interlude for the next sort of half a page. We're going to go into an interlude not about Esther and Mordechai and Haman, but rather about the story of one of Esther and Mordechai's ancestors, Binyamin. Now, this sort of is very much related to the story of the Megillah, because Binyamin is sort of where the story begins. The whole story of King Saul, and who's a descendant of Binyamin, and then the story of Mordechai and Esther are also descendants of Binyamin. So let's launch into this story. L'chulam nasan la'ish chalifos simalos, u'levinyamin nasan chamesh chalifos. That it says in the story that when the brothers appeared before Yosef and they sat down to a meal, he gives each one of the brothers a gift of a new set of clothing, but for Binyamin he gives 5 sets of clothing. So the Gemara's challenge is, Efshir davar shenitztar bo oso tzadik yikashel bo. He says, how could it be that Yosef, whose whole life was turned upside down through jealousy that was created by their father by giving Yosef more than his brothers, how could Yosef now duplicate that very same mistake and openly give Binyamin in the presence of his brothers more than the other brothers? De Amar Rava bar Machasya, Amar Rav Chama bar Guria, Amar Rav Bishvil Mishkal Shnei Sloim Milei Shosef Yaakov LeYosef Mishar Echav Niskalgal Hadarva V'Yarder Aboseinu LeMitzrayim. It was only because of that 2 sellas worth of extra silk that Yaakov used to weave the coat of many colors, the Ksones Pasim, and gave to Yosef, that created the jealousy. And that's what ultimately resulted in our ancestors ending up as slaves in Egypt. So if Yosef was aware that jealousy can be so destructive, why did he generate the jealousy by giving Binyamin 5 times the clothing that he had given to the other brothers? Amar Rabbi Binyamin bar Yefes remez ramazlo sha'asid ben laseis mimenu sheyetzim lifnei hamelech b'chamisha levushay malchus. The answer is, you're right. Normally Yosef would not do such a thing, but it was necessary in order to generate a prophetic message that needed to be generated at this time. That eventually Yosef was alluding, one of your descendants will emerge from the king's palace wearing 5 different types of clothing. And that's what the 5 sets of clothing represented that he was giving to Binyamin. Shenamar, as it says, Mordechai yatsa bilavush malchus techeles bachur ba'ater zahav gidolah v'sachrich butz v'argaman. That if you look at the pasuk, it says that Mordechai emerges from the palace of the king, wearing these 5 different types of royal clothing. So that prophecy was activated at the time of Binyamin, and that's why Yosef did what he did. Now, we continue the story of Binyamin, and this is fast-forwarding in the story. After Yosef reveals himself to his brothers, it says that he goes to rush to hug and embrace his brother Binyamin. It says, Vayipol al savarei Binyamin achiv, that he fell on the necks of Binyamin. And the word savarei is in the plural. So the Gemara says, this is silly. Kamat savarin hayulo leila Binyamin. How many necks did Binyamin have? Why do you say necks in the plural when he only has 1 neck? So Amar Rebbe Elazar bachal shnei mikdashim shasidim lios bechelkol shel Binyamin ve'asidin licharev. The word neck Tzavarech in Shir Hashirim is a remez to the Beis Hamikdash because it's tall and it's beautiful like marble. So therefore, when it says that he fell on Binyamin's neck, it's a reference to the two temples. That part, the Holy of Holies, would be on Binyamin's portion. So that's what Yosef was crying, because he saw prophetically that the two temples of Binyamin would eventually be destroyed. Uvinyamin bachal tzavarav bachal mishkan shilo shasid lios bechelko shel Yosef asid l'charv. And when it says that Binyamin cried on Yosef's neck, it's a reference to the fact that Binyamin saw prophetically that the Mishkan, the tabernacle that would be established for a few hundred years in the portion of Ephraim, would also eventually be destroyed, and that's why Binyamin cried on Yosef's neck. The word neck, once again, as an allusion to the temple. Now, when Yosef then reveals himself to his brothers, he dispatches his brothers, says, "Go back to my father's house," and he says, "and tell him that I'm still alive." And he says, "And your eyes see as well as the eyes of my brother Binyamin." So he's creating this equation between his brothers and Binyamin. Amar Rebbe Lazar, Amar Lahem, Kishem she'ein belibi al Binyamin achi, shelahaya b'mechirasi, kach ein belibi aleichem. And what he was trying to explain to them was, just like I have no tainas, I have no grievance against Binyamin, who was not complicit in my sale, I similarly have no grievance against you anymore. I totally forgive you. Kifi hamedaber aleichem, and the last part of that pasuk says, because it is my mouth that is speaking to you, meaning to say, Kifi kain libi, my mouth is sincere. My mouth is just like my heart. Whatever I feel in my heart, I'm speaking to you sincerely. Ula aviv shalach kazos asarach chamorim nosim mituv Mitzrayim. That the pasuk says that when he dispatched his brothers to go back to their father in Canaan, he sends 10 donkeys laden with the goodness of Egypt on the donkeys. So my mituv Mitzrayim, what was laden on those donkeys? So Amar Rabbi Yamin bar Yefes, Amar Rabbi Lazar, Shalach lo yayin yashan, shedaz zekenim no chehimenu. He sent 10 donkeys laden with aged wine, because old people have nachas, they get sort of a restoration of peace of mind when they drink aged wine. I never liked wine growing up. I guess I'm getting older, I'm starting to enjoy it. A nice glass of wine is good sometimes. I guess when you get old, you start to appreciate it. So then the Gemara says that the brothers come to Yosef and they fall before him as to ask for his mercy. So Amar Rabbi Binyamin bar Yefes, Amar Rabbi Lazar, Hainu darmi inshi ta'ala be'idnei sagidlei. This story is reflective of the saying that people have, that even the fox, who was considered to be one of the lowliest of the creatures of the forest, when he's riding high, when he's being successful, you have to bow down even to the fox. So the Gemara says, Ta'ala mai b'tziruse me'achva. So the Gemara says that aphorism is not appropriate for this story, because Yosef is not a fox compared to his brother. He's not inferior to his brothers. He may be their equal. So why would you say that he's like a fox compared to his brothers? But rather, says the Gemara, Eli itmar hachi itmar. But you're right, that aphorism applies to the following. Vayishtachu Yisrael al Rosh Hamita. That in the next parsha, when it talks about Yaakov Avinu moving down to Egypt, and as he's getting close to death, he's lying in his bed, and when Yosef comes in, he bows down to the head of his bed. And from here you see that even though Yaakov was Yosef's father, and Yosef was his inferior, Amar Rabbi Binyamin bar Yefes, Amar Rabbi Lazar, Ta'ala be'idnei sagila. You see from here that even a fox, when he's successful, even though he's your inferior, you have to bow down to him. And that's why Yaakov bowed down to his son Yosef. Vayinachem osam vayidaber al libam. The Torah also tells us that the brothers were very fearful of Yosef, and he had to comfort them and speak to their heart. Amar Rabbi Binyamin bar Yefes, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Melamed she'amar lahem dvarim shemiskablim al halev. This teaches us that he spoke to them words that would appeal to their heart, meaning he tried to reason with them that they would be safe and that he was not trying to harm them. Well, he said to them as follows: Uma asara neros lo yachal l'chabos ner echad heich yachal l'chabos asara neros. He said to them as follows: Look, if 10 candles cannot extinguish one candle, how do you think that one candle would be able to extinguish 10 candles? You, 10 brothers, tried to wipe me out, and you were unsuccessful. So surely I will be unsuccessful, even were I to attempt to extinguish all 10 of you. So now that interlude is over, We've concluded our discussion of Binyamin. Let's go now back to the story of the Megillah. We pick up with the story where it says, La Yehudim Haisa Ora V'Simcha V'Sasam V'Ikar. This is a famous Gemara because we say this pasuk in Havdalah. The Jews had light and happiness and joy and honor. Amar Rav Yehuda, or glory. Amar Rav Yehuda Ora Zu Torah. The word ora, light, refers to Torah, that now they were able to freely study Torah as before they were being repressed. V'chein hu omer ki ner mitzvah the Torah or, as the pasuk says in Mishlei, that the Torah is compared to light. Simcha ze yom tov. When it says happiness, it refers to the fact that they were able to, as a result of the Purim story, declare a special celebratory holiday called Purim. And that's what the word simcha implies. V'chein hu omer v'samachta b'chagecha. And so too does it say, you shall rejoice on your holiday. And sason zumila. And this tells us that the Jews were denied the opportunity to do bris milah because of Haman's edicts. And now that they were successful against him, the bris milah was able to be restored. V'chein hu omer, as it says, sas anochi li marasecha. And so does the pasuk say, I rejoice, using that same verb, over your commandment, which the Gemara says David HaMelech said when he was in the bathhouse. Why did he say it when he was in the bathhouse? Because when you were in the bathhouse, you're completely naked. So the Medrash says David was naked in the bathhouse. He said, I'm bare of any mitzvah. What mitzvah do I have when I'm not wearing any clothes? I don't have my tzitzis on. I don't have my tefillin on. Then he looks down and he realizes, oh, I have a bris milah. So therefore, sas anochi al imrosecha, I can rejoice over your commandment of bris. And that's how I know that the word sason refers to bris milah. V'yikar, and finally the word yakar, honor or glory, that's referring to the tefillin. V'chein hu omer v'rou kol hamei haaretz ki shem Hashem nikra alecha v'yaru mimeka. As the pasuk says, that all the nations of the world will see that the name of God is called upon you, referring to the tefillin, and they shall have awe from you, which is the glory or honor that the Jews had. The Tanya Rebbe Lazar Hagadol Omer Elu tefillin shabar. This refers to the head tefillin. The next part of the Megillah says,
so, Rabbi, why does this come an integral part of Gedalia? That we even repeat it.
It's a very good question. What is it doing with having to do with Havdalah? Probably as a restorative consolation after Shabbos is leaving. We have to remember we still have all of these other mitzvahs that we can do during the week. Next, Ve'es Parshandasa. The Megillah lists the 10 sons of Haman and lists them by name, and then it says Aseres b'nei Haman. These are the 10 sons of Haman. So, Amar Avada de Minyafo, Aseres b'nei Haman v'Aseres tzarech l'memirnu b'neshima echas. That when you read the Megillah, you have to recite all 10 names plus the word Aseres in one breath. My taima kulu bahade hadadi nafik nishmasayo, because they all died in one breath. They all died simultaneously, hanging on the gallows. Amar Rabbi Yochanan vav de vayezasa tzarech lamimtecha bezekifa ki mordaya de lavros. That when you say the last name of the last name of the 10 sons of Haman, his last son was known as Vaizasa. That letter Vav you have to elongate. You notice it's actually a bigger Vav than all of the other letters on the parchment. You also have to say Vaizasa. And the reason why you do that is because my taima kulu b'chad zekifa is dakifu, because they were all lined up on the gallows all at one time. So the letter vav represents being lined up and strung up to be hanged on the gallows. That all happened together simultaneously, and remind yourself by elongating that letter vav like a long oar that you use to maneuver through the river. Amar Rabbi Chanina bar Papa Darash Rab Shila Ish Kafar Tamrasa Kol Hashiros Kula Nichtavos Ariach Al Gabi Leveno Uleven Al Gabi Ariach Chutz Mishirazu. He says that all other texts that are written in staggered form with space between them, it's like different songs in the Torah, like Az Yashir, for example, and other sections, they're always written staggered, such that one line has let's say 3 different sets of words, and then the next line has 2 sets of words, not filling in the blank space of the previous line. Right? So like Az Yashir, you imagine it's staggered, so that it's like a brick, just like a bricklayer staggers the bricks and doesn't put the bricks directly above in columns, but he staggers them in order to reinforce the wall. So too, normally a shira would be in that staggered format with the words arranged in that fashion. The 2 exceptions are our story of the 10 sons of Haman, chutz mishira zu umalchei Canaan she'ariach al gabi ariach ulevein al gabi leveina, except for the 10 sons of Haman, which are stacked with blank space exclusively between the 2 columns, and also the 31 kings that Yehoshua defeated are also written in that same way. My time shlote tekumala mapalas, and the answer is because we don't want it to be staggered like a brick wall, which will be strong and endure. We want to represent the fact that just like if you stack bricks without staggering them, it'll fall down. So too, the 10 sons of Haman and the 31 Canaanite kings, we want them to remain in their falling down state.
Ha'azinu is not written like that. Ha'azinu.
It's a good question. What about Ha'azinu? It's an excellent question. I don't know why the Gemara doesn't count Ha'azinu and doesn't mention it, but Ha'azinu also talks about the curses, that the bad things that will befall the Jewish people in towards the end of their history. So we don't want that to have permanence either. Why the Gemara doesn't mention it? Sarachian, it's a very good question. Vayomer hamelech le'ester hamalka b'shushan habiroh haragu ha'yehudim. So if you take a look at this pasuk, after the 10 sons of Haman are hanged, it says that the king Achashverosh turns to Esther and he says, "Listen, Esther, in Shushan, look how many people the Jews killed. Now, what else do you want?" So it sounds like in the first part of the pasuk he's becoming impatient with her, like saying, "What are you nagging me again for?" But then you look at the last part of the pasuk and it says, "Uma bakasha seichod v'seyas," whatever you want, I'll give you. So it almost sounds like sounds like there's a change in tone from an annoyed tone at the beginning of the pasuk to a very loving tone at the end of the pasuk. So this teaches us that an angel came and slapped Achashverosh upside the head in order to get him to change his attitude towards Esther. So Amar Amra mi boile. It then says in the Megillah that when she came before the king, he said that it should be in a scroll. Now it should have said, she said that it should be written in a scroll. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan Amra lo Yomar bepeh mashakasav b'sefer. What she was telling Achashverosh was that it's not enough to write in a scroll the new edict for the Jews, but I want you to proclaim it loudly. I want you to say it. And that's what she meant to say, that he shall say, meaning referring to her husband Achashverosh. Divrei shalom ve'emes. I want you to say words of peace and truth. So Amar Rabbi Tanchum v'Amrila Amar Rabbi Asi melamish etzricha sirtut ka'amita shel Torah. The fact that the story of Esther is called words of truth teaches me that it has to be just like a Sefer Torah, because the Torah is called the book of truth. And therefore this teaches me that just like a Sefer Torah has to have lines in it so that you can write the words on a straight line, so too when you write a Megillah you have to have sirtut, which are those lines that are scrolled into the parchment with a engraving tool in order to make sure that you have straight lines. Uma'amar Esther Kiyam. So Ma'amar Esther in Divrei Atzamos Lo. So it says at the end towards the end of the Megillah, it says that the words of Esther were fulfilled. So the Gemara says, what do you mean the words of Esther were fulfilled by being written down in the Megillah? You mean to tell me that the first part of the story, which was all the fasting and the sackcloth, is not going to be written in the Megillah? So Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan says, no. Hachi Kamar. The way you read the pasuk is, Uma'amar divrei hatzomos uma'amar Esther kiyam es yemei hapurim ha'ela. That you take the last words of the previous pasuk and you append them to the new pasuk. Because the previous words of the last words of the previous pasuk was divrei hatzamos v'za'akasam, the fasting and the cries of the Jewish people. So you take those words and you say, and the words of Esther, or the story of Esther, how she saved the Jews, was now established in the scroll of Purim, of the book of Esther. So meaning that both the first part of the story and the second part of the story are recorded for all posterity. The last pasuk now of Megillah Esther, Ki Mordechai ha-Yehudi Mishneh lamelech Achashverosh v'gadola Yehudim v'ratzui l'ro v'chav. After all, Mordechai the Jew was a minister to the king, and he was great for the Jews, and he was desired or loved by most of his brethren. So the Gemara says, l'ro v'echav v'lo l'chol echav. What does it mean that he was loved by most of his brethren? What, didn't everyone love Mordechai? No. Melamed Shapirshu Mimenu Mixa Sanhedrin. This teaches us that some of the Sanhedrin actually dissented from Mordechai. Why? Because they said, Mordechai, what's a great rabbi like you getting involved in politics? You should stay in the base medrash and remain a scholar. And therefore we feel what you're doing is incorrect. So the Chassam Sofer asks the question, I may have said this to you once before, he says, why would the Megillah end with something that's critical of Mordechai? It sounds a little strange to criticize Mordechai, say that some of the members of the Sanhedrin dissented from him. The Chassam Sofer says that's not a criticism, that's actually a bracha, that everyone needs critics. What do you think kept Mordechai in check for the rest of his life? The fact that he had people scrutinizing him and constantly pointing a finger and saying, we got our eyes on you, Mordechai, we see what you're doing, we're going to keep an eye on you. That's what kept Mordechai on the up and up for the rest of his life. Words to live by. Amar Rav Yosef, Gadol Talmud Torah Yoser Mehatzalos Nefashas. So Rav Yosef says that Torah study is more important than saving lives. And how do you know this? To me, Kara Chashuv Leila Mordechai Basar Dalit, Ulabasof Basar Chamisha. Because originally Mordechai's name is counted in a list of those who came up with Ezra, and he's fourth. He comes after 4 people on the list, and then afterwards, his name, after he does the whole story of Esther and he becomes a minister in the king's court, he leaves the base medrash, he's 6th on the list after 5 that come before him. Meikaraksiv, because originally in the listing of the people in Sefer Ezra it says Asher Boim Zerubbabel, Yeshua, Nehemiah, Serara, Re'elaya, Mordechai, Bilshan, etc. So Mordechai is 5th on the list. So, but then Ulbasov Ksiv, but then afterwards, later in Sefer Nehemiah says, Habohimim Zerubbabel, Yeshua, Nehemiah, Azariah, Ra'amya, Nachmani, Mordechai. Then it puts Mordechai as 6th on the list. So it shows that he had descended in his prestige among his colleagues. Okay. So, Amar Rav V'Tema Rav Shmuel Bar Marta Gadol Talmud Torah Yosem Binyan Beis Hamikdash. We also see that Torah study is even more important than building a temple. Shekol Zman Shebarach Beineri Yakayam Lo Hinicho Ezra V'Ola. That who was Ezra's Rebbe? It was a man named Baruch ben Neriah, who was one of the Nevi'im. Now Baruch ben Neriah never left Bavel. He was too old and elderly to leave Bavel. As long as Baruch ben Neriah was alive, Ezra refused to leave Bavel to go and build the temple. So you see that because he wanted to learn Torah from his Rebbe, and therefore you see that Talmud Torah is more important than building the temple. Amar Rabba, Amar Rav Yitzchak, Bar Shmuel, Bar Marta, Gadol Talmud Torah Yoser Mikibud Av. Va'ain, you see that it's even more important than honoring one's parents. Shekalosan Shanim She Yaakov Avinu Bebeis Aver Lo Nanash, because all those years that Yaakov was learning Torah in the yeshiva of Shem Va'aver, he was not penalized. And we'll go through tomorrow. We'll go through the numbers that the Gemara is going to refer to us, but basically the numbers are the numbers of years that Yaakov absented himself from his parents equals the number of years that Yosef absented himself from Yaakov's life by being in Egypt. But that correlation only works if you subtract the number of years that 14 years that Yaakov was learning Torah in Shem Va'aver. He shouldn't be penalized for that because Torah study trumps honoring your parents.
22 years, right?
No. It was 14 years he was in Shem Va'aver. We'll talk about it. 22 years that he was away from his parents. Have a wonderful day.